Is the Bible canon a problem for Orthodox Christians? I will be going deep into this question today. You will not find this information anywhere else because I do original research with real books and real information to give you the best possible answer to these questions. So get your cup of coffee, get cozy, because we're going to be going deep into this today. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for future content on the Bible and Orthodox Christian topics, and that like button if you find this video helpful. Let's get right into it. Now, right out of the gate, I want to acknowledge some challenges when dealing with the Bible canon in Orthodox Christianity. I think this is very important because if you don't hear it from me, guess who you're going to hear it from? You're going to hear it from opponents of Orthodoxy. You're going to hear it from Catholics. You're going to hear it from Protestants who are attacking the Orthodox Church. And it doesn't help the Orthodox cause to sweep under the rug difficulties or challenges that we're facing when dealing with the canon. So I just want to put all the cards on the table right out of the get-go so that we are knowing what we're dealing with and we can approach this with a holistic and honest and transparent approach, okay? So the canon is not self-evident. I think you already know this, okay? If you say that the Bible defines the Bible, it's obviously circular. But more than that, we have the issue that not every book is quoted from in other books of the Bible. For example, in the New Testament, never quotes from Judges, never quotes from Ruth, Esther, so on. Okay, so if you go by references and quotations in the Bible, you won't even have a complete Bible because not every book references other books, okay? And if you go by quotations in the Bible, you'll end up putting books in there which are not canonical scriptures, like Enoch, which is referenced in Jude 14 through 15. So it's not a self-evident thing. It takes some outside source to confirm which books are in the Bible. There's just no way around it. Now, there is no single set of criteria for canonicity. This is another challenge that applies to all books. Okay, so in the Old Testament, not every book was written by a prophet. Some we don't know who wrote it. In the New Testament, not every book was written by an apostle. So you can't base canonicity on the status of the person who wrote it. Not all books were written in Hebrew in the Old Testament, so there's no linguistic continuity. There are portions of the Bible in Aramaic, like in Daniel, Ezra, and Jeremiah. Now you say, well, maybe we can go by which books were widely used or received by ancient Jews and early Christians. Well, that's not going to work either because there were books that were disputed in ancient Judaism and Christianity. This is well documented. Books like Esther and Song of Songs, Revelation, James, Jude, and so on were disputed in ancient Judaism and early Christianity. So it's already starting off on very sandy foundations here, trying to build an understanding of what books are canonical. Well, the problems keep coming. Maybe we'll look at ancient Christian Bibles, see what those contained. Well, the problem with that is ancient Christian Bibles are fragmentary. So we don't even have any complete Bible, but those which we do have don't even agree. Okay, so Codex Sinaiticus has the book of 2nd Esdras, but that book is lacking in Codex Vaticanus and Alexandrinus. Codex Alexandrinus has 4 books of Maccabees, Sinaiticus has 2, and Vaticanus has none. Okay, so which of these Bibles represents the true canon? Well, they obviously disagree, so there's a problem there. That challenge is before us when trying to discern the books of the Bible. Now, different lists have been put forward by the fathers. So if you want to go to the patristic sources to find the lists of books of the Bible, you'll run into trouble because the lists do not agree or do not seem to agree on the surface. That's another challenge. You have to work through and interpret these lists from the fathers. Now, some fathers categorize books in a kind of tiered system, but the problem with that is that the tiers don't even match. Okay, so some fathers have one book in the first tier, some put that book in the second tier, like Esther, which is first tier in Cyril of Jerusalem, but second tier in Athanasius. So which tier does Esther belong in? Okay, some fathers didn't even teach tiers at all, like Saint Augustine. Now, those who did teach tiers didn't even seem to follow those tiers anyways. Athanasius recognized a second tier for teaching, the catechumens, or for reading, but he himself uses books from that category in his own writings to prove doctrine. So these tiers seem kind of meaningless in practice. So we've got all kinds of things going on in the patristic sources which require interpretation. This is a challenge when approaching the canon from an Orthodox perspective. Now, we also have linguistic issues with the word canon or canonical or divine or divinely inspired. The fathers don't seem to be using even the same meanings when they're using these words. Canonical can sometimes mean some books which are canonical, but not all of them. Sometimes it refers to books that are canonical between Jews and Christians, sometimes only with Christians, sometimes it's closed, sometimes it's not. Okay, and we just need to be careful when assuming that canonical always means the same thing. That's going to make interpreting the fathers a challenge. Some books are referenced or quoted from in the fathers, and it seems like they're treating them as scripture, like 4th Maccabees, 2nd Esdras, Enoch, and so on. We're going to have to make a judgment on whether or not they believe those books are canonical scriptures when interpreting the canon from the fathers. So that's another challenge, is how do you tell when they're quoting from a book simply as a book and quoting from a book that they believe is scripture? Now, no ecumenical council has produced a list of books of canonical scripture. No single list, right? So we have the 6th Ecumenical Council, which ratified local councils and fathers with canons that contain lists, but those lists don't match. They have different books in those lists. So what do you do with that? That's another challenge. How do you interpret that? Are they defining the canon at all? Or are they intending that we harmonize these lists in some way? What do we do with that? That's another challenge. The Septuagint represents the traditional Old Testament of the church, but how do you determine which books are in that Septuagint? The Septuagint has been lost. So that's another challenge point. The challenges continue. Okay, local councils produce lists like Carthage in 419 and Jerusalem in 1672, but many Orthodox Christians will dispute the authority of those councils as being binding on the whole church, right? Is that a local council, or is it binding over the whole church? Okay, that's also going to be a challenge. If you pick a local council to base your canon on, you're going to have to argue how that represents the whole church and not that local church specifically. Well, what about the church services? Doesn't that tell us what books are canonical scriptures? Well, not every canonical book is read in the services. This is another problem. A famous example is Revelation, which doesn't find itself in the lectionaries of the Orthodox Church. And if you look through a prophetologion, you will see that some books from the Old Testament are missing as well. So you can't even go to the services for a clear answer on which books are canonical. What about modern Orthodox Bibles? Don't those contain the canon of scriptures for Orthodox? Well, those books don't agree. Those versions of the Bible don't even agree amongst themselves. Some Orthodox Bibles have books set out as non-canonical. Others include them with the rest of the books as canonical. So you're going to run into problems there. Not even all published Bibles agree. And even disagreements among Orthodox people. Okay. So I have an example here of Father Thomas Hopko. He is arguing that the deuterocanonical books are canonical parts of Scripture. He says also the so-called apocryphal books listed above after Esther are considered by the Orthodox as genuine parts of the Bible. The Old Testament Apocrypha is a body of writings considered by the non-Orthodox to be of close association with the Bible, but not actually part of its official canonical contents. Now, on the contrary, we have Father Michael Pomazanski in his book, Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, and he says the non-canonical books of the Old Testament are Tobit, Judith, the Wisdom of Solomon, so on. Okay, and he says the church accepts these latter books also as useful and instructive, and in antiquity assigned to them for instructive reading, not only in homes, but also in churches, which is why they have been called ecclesiastical. So for him, these are not canonical books. They're just useful for instruction and for teaching. So which is it? We have two very highly esteemed clerics and Orthodox writers who seem to be in disagreement on the canon. What do we do with this situation? Which do we follow? Do we follow the Orthodox Bible? Which Bible? Do we follow the fathers? Which father? Do we follow the councils? Which council? And which version of that council? Do we follow the Septuagint? How do you know which books are in the Septuagint? The situation is pretty complicated. Now, again, I want to just throw all the cards out on the table and be fully transparent at the difficulties when dealing with the canon in Orthodox Christianity, because if I don't say it to you, you're going to hear it from someone else who's a hostile. And it's better for you to be aware of these problems so that you're not caught off guard when discussing apologetics with other people. So just be aware that all of the avenues by which Orthodox Christians can determine the canon come with their pros and their cons, and you should be aware of those cons and have a more holistic understanding of the canon. So it's not all bad news. We have some good news on the canon as well, and this would be my response to those people who use these challenges as a weapon against the Orthodox Church. Now, if we ask the question, do these challenges discredit Orthodoxy in any way? Well, the answer is no, they do not. The validity and the authenticity of the Orthodox Church does not stand on whether or not it has a universally held and defined list of books for the canon. Okay, that's a ridiculous assumption. Now, we know that because this is not a new problem. It's been a problem in the church from the very beginning. The presence of disputed books does not discredit the Orthodox Church any more than it discredits the church of the first 6 centuries, okay? So the moment that you take disputes over certain books and you weaponize that and say that discredits your church, well, guess what? You just attacked the entire early church because there were books that were disputed then as well. And we know there are disputes over certain books because Eusebius tells us that in his church history book 3, chapter 25. He goes over a number of books that were disputed in the early church. Now, nobody would say that the early church then is discredited and inauthentic just because there were disputes over certain books. We have the same reported in Junilis in the 6th century. He reports that some books of the Bible were received by some, but not received by others. Right? He says many people add 2 books of the Chronicles, Job, Tobit, so on. But that many people is not everybody, right? So even in the 6th century, we have reports in the East that there are certain disputes over certain books, okay? So this is not an orthodoxy problem. This is a Christian problem. It's a Christian challenge, okay? So you can't use this as if somehow this is an orthodoxy problem. This has been in the church from the very beginning. Now, Protestants have the exact same problems. They have a mixed heritage. They have the same early church to deal with. They have no ecumenically defined list of books. They have no universal agreement on the canon. There are Protestants who receive the deuterocanonical books as canonical scriptures. That's a fact. I know some personally, right? So they don't even have the same criteria that they're trying to push and expect from the Orthodox Church. We just need to acknowledge that they have the exact same problems. They're in the exact same boat on the mixed heritage of the Christian church. Now, Catholics had the same problem for a long time, for centuries. They also had a mixed heritage, right? Now, eventually they did define their canon. The papal affirmations of the African Code, the Council of Florence, the Council of Trent, all of these provided for the Catholics a neat and ecumenically defined list, but that list was not there from the beginning, okay? It was a list that came after centuries, and during those centuries there were disputes over certain books. So we all share the same messy heritage. Nobody has the canonical high ground to stand on and start pointing fingers. The best thing that Catholics can say is they have an added convenience that they have an ecumenically defined list, but they can't turn on the Orthodox and weaponize that against them without shooting their own heritage in the foot. Now, despite the messiness of the Orthodox Church and the question of the canon, we still have an authoritative sacred tradition which provides an epistemic foundation. So we aren't clueless as to what books are canonical. We have a sacred tradition that retains information on which books are canonical. That tradition is apostolic in nature, so the apostolic deposit of faith is passed on through the life of the church, and that contains the knowledge of which books are canonical, okay? Now, Catholics also have a sacred tradition. They have an added convenience of a definitive list affirmed at their ecumenical councils. But Protestants are really in the worst position of these three just because they reject the council's authority and they reject the authority of sacred tradition as well, right? So they're going to put the Bible above the authority of the councils and the tradition, but because the Bible has no equal authority, it has no equal authority to define that Bible. The Orthodox Church is not in that position. We actually have an authoritative sacred tradition by which we can define the Bible. So there is an epistemic foundation in Orthodoxy, which is lacking in Protestantism. Now, the Orthodox Church is endowed with the sacred tradition of the apostles. The tradition is known through the life of the church, through its various expressions. Okay, so what am I talking about? Expressions of the life of the church. its tradition. I'm talking about the services of the church fathers, the manuscripts produced by the church canons, the church councils. All of these are expressions of the church's apostolic tradition, and all of these can be utilized to determine which books are canonical for Orthodox Christians. Now, this ethos is declared at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which says a forged letter of the divine apostle to the Laodiceans is said to be included in certain books of the apostle, but our fathers rejected it and not his, and the Manichees slipped in a gospel according to Thomas, which the Catholic Church piously rejects as alien. So according to the Seventh Ecumenical Council, how do you know which books to receive, which to reject? Well, it's the fathers, it's the church, right? It's these expressions of the tradition which are able to determine whether or not books should be received as canonical. Now, I want to reframe the perspective that a lot of people have. A lot of people have this perspective that the Orthodox Church does not have a canon, okay? They don't have a canon. They don't have a single list that's defined that everybody agrees upon. But the problem with that perspective is it doesn't present a full picture of the situation, okay? Now, the true situation is that there are many books, in fact, the majority of books of Scripture, which are unanimously agreed upon and indisputable. But some books have a little bit less clear status. Now, that's a more accurate description of the canon in Orthodox Christianity. It's not like it's total, utter confusion. There are a majority of books that everybody agrees on. It's completely backed by our fathers and our councils. But there are a few minority of books which have a little bit less clear status, which require more investigation into our tradition to determine their status, okay? So, for example, of all the patristic and synodal lists ratified at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, 84% of books are universally included in those lists. Okay, so for the Orthodox Church, the Quinisext Council, or the Council of Trullo, is a part of the Sixth Ecumenical Council. That's a part of our canon law. Now, the Quinisext Council in its Canon 2 ratified a number of canons, and there's a number of lists of books of Scripture in those canons which don't exactly agree with each other, but 84% of the books in the total number of books listed are in total agreement in every single list. Okay, so this just gives you an example of the unanimity among certain books, the majority of books in the Bible. That includes the Pentateuch, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, the books of Samuel and Kings, Chronicles, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, in the New Testament, the Gospels, Acts, Paul's epistles, and so on, okay? All of these books are unanimously agreed on in our canons, stamped with the approval of an ecumenical council. It doesn't get any more sure than that. So we're not left completely in the dark as to which books are in the Bible. We know at least with 100% certainty, unanimous across the board, the majority of books, there's no question. And the other books are not left in darkness either. We just can look at other sources of our tradition to determine their status, okay? So a much more accurate description of the situation in Orthodoxy is that the Orthodox Church has a canon, but the canonicity of certain books, a minority, about 16%, requires further investigation into the church's tradition to discern their status. Okay, so it takes a little bit of work for that minority of books to determine whether or not the church receives these as canonical in her tradition, but the majority of books are very solid. There's no question about them at all. Now, here's what that looks like. I have listed the lists which are ratified at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and you can see which lists include or exclude certain books. And there's a lot more green on this chart than there is red. So they are much more in agreement than not, okay? And the ones that are not included in every list, we can look at other sources in the church to determine their status. The New Testament looks similar, overwhelmingly in agreement on which books are a part of the New Testament. Now, where do you find the tradition of the church? Which expressions specifically? How do you determine those books which are a little bit less clear about their canonicity? How do you determine whether or not they are part of the scriptures for Orthodox Christians? Well, the status of books whose canonicity is less clear can be determined through the quotations and treatment of those books in the Fathers and the ecumenical councils. How are the Fathers using them? How are they talking about them? Are they using them as scriptures? Are they calling them scriptures? Another way is to look at books read in the church. Okay, so the books that are read as scripture in the churches tell us that those books are recognized as canonical. Okay, so that's another place we can go to. Other lists in the Fathers and Local Councils, like lists provided by St. Augustine, Synod of Jerusalem, 1672. All of those are expressions of our tradition as well. The Septuagint tradition is another tradition that we can lean on, expression of our sacred tradition, which is witnessed in early and ancient Christian writers, and manuscript like the Hexapla, which tells us which books were understood to comprise the Old Testament in the Septuagint tradition. We also have historic Bible traditions, which we can lean on to see which books are generally held by Orthodox Christians to be canonical. Okay, so some very specific examples for you, because I know that you don't want anything wishy-washy. You want very clear-cut answers. Well, here we go. The fourth session of Nicaea II, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, calls the Book of Wisdom Scripture and quotes it along with other canonical books. Okay, so you can see this in multiple places in this session. This is one of many examples of deuterocanonical books quoted from in the ecumenical councils, but there you have an expression of the church's tradition in an ecumenical council affirming that wisdom is scripture. So that's one of those books whose canonicity might be a little bit less clear because it's excluded in some ancient lists, but we can see that the Seventh Ecumenical Council used it as scripture and affirms it as scripture for the Orthodox. So we would absolutely receive that based on the authority of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Wisdom is also read on the Wednesday of the fifth week of Great Lent, okay, along with Sirach. So this is one of many examples where the deuterocanonical books are read from in the services of the church. We have the list of books from St. Augustine in his On Christian Doctrine, where he lists the books that he understands to be the universal Christian canon of scriptures. We have the Syro-Hexapla, which survives through various ancient manuscripts. And this represents the Hexapla, which was produced by Origen, which reflects the Septuagint tradition. Which books were in the Septuagint in the early Christian period would give us a clue as to what books are in the Old Testament for the Orthodox Church. We have the great unseals, right? The Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, which contain books in them. If we compare them, we can see which books are typically included or understood to be included in Christian Bibles in the Orthodox Church. We have the Synod of Jerusalem in 1672, which produced a list. It's a local council, but it had wide reception in the Orthodox Church, so certainly would reflect the opinion of the Orthodox Church at its time, and I think it's a very important witness. We have the Vulgate, which represents the books that were understood to be scripture in the West. We have the Slavonic Bibles, like the Gennady Bible, the Elizabeth Bible, which represent the Slavonic tradition, the Slavonic Orthodox tradition, and show us which books were included in the Orthodox Bible in the Slavonic tradition. Now, it does require some work to discern, okay? So you have to dig in a little bit for those books which are a little bit disputed in church history. You have to dig into those expressions of our tradition and do a little work, get your hands dirty. But the point is that the Orthodox Church has an epistemic solid ground to stand on to determine those books. We have a living tradition in the church from which we can draw these things. Okay, so having work required to determine the canon is not the same thing as lacking a basis in determining the canon. Those are two very different situations. We have a basis for the canon. It just takes a little bit of work to discern those books in our tradition. Now, there's one very critical aspect of the canon discussion in Orthodoxy that I don't hear brought up too often, but it's the question asking, why are there differences in early Christian lists and Orthodox Bibles? Okay, so we know that differences exist. We know that those differences don't discredit the church, but we can ask, why are there those differences in the first place? And if you ask that question and you do some investigation, you will find that there's historic reasons for why those lists disagree, and that will help you to discern the actual Christian traditional canon versus outside influences on that canon, okay? So one of those historical circumstances is the presence of the Rabbinic Jewish canon, which came after the time of Christ. So Christian communities inherited a collection of scriptures from ancient Judaism, which was larger than the Rabbinic canon that came later, okay, came around the 2nd century. It wasn't until the Rabbinic period after Christ that the smaller canon was defined and standardized by the Jews. Okay, this is not controversial. Scholars acknowledge this in the history of the Bible canon. Dr. Malka Simkovich writes, while the notion of sacred scriptures was well in place by the end of the Second Temple period, Jews at this time enjoyed a higher degree of fluidity when it came to the notion of authoritative texts. It would not be until the Rabbinic period that Jews confronted the question of what books were to be included in or excluded from the biblical canon. So this is a very important turn of historical events, that after the time of Christ, during the Rabbinic period, the Jews standardized a smaller set of books as their canon than what the Christians were using. The Christians were using a larger set of authoritative books than the Jews from this point forward. So that's going to be very important, because this Rabbinic canon will go on to influence the opinions of many Christians throughout the following centuries. So the Rabbinic canon influenced Christians, especially through the writings of Origen, who had learned about the canon from Jews of his time. Okay, so you see in Eusebius, he reports that Origen writes that the 22 books of the Hebrews are the following, and then he goes on to list a smaller canon. So this is the first time in the Christian writings that we see any mention of 22 books. Okay, so this is something that Origen would have picked up from the Jews of his time, and this would have been read by many fathers during and after the 3rd century. Now, Christians often failed to distinguish between the views of Rabbinic Jews of their current time and those of the Jews during the Apostles' time. They just assumed that Jews were Jews. But, as we know today, the Jews defined a smaller canon than what some Jews were using in an earlier period. So the early Christians inherited a larger corpus of books than the Rabbinic Jews were using in the later patristic era. This is a very important distinction that a lot of Christians just weren't aware of at the time. So they might have meant well by pushing this 22-book theory, but they didn't realize that they're actually pushing for a post-Christian Rabbinic canon, not the traditional canon of the church. Now, this opinion is not my own. I will quote from you Dr. Henry Sweet. Now, this is super, super important, because this will explain why there are differences in early Christian lists. Why are some so small? Why are they talking about 22 books? Well, he's going to analyze all of the data before Origen and after, and he comes to the following conclusion. He says, there can be little doubt that, notwithstanding the strict adherence of the Eastern lists to the number of the Hebrew books, the Old Latin canon, he's talking about the canon of St. Augustine or the Council of Carthage, truly represents the collection of Greek sacred books which came into the hands of the early Christian communities at Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. When Origen and the Greek fathers who follow him fixed the number of the books at 22 or 24, they follow not the earlier tradition of the church, but the corrected estimate of Christian scholars who had learned it from Jewish teachers. An earlier tradition is represented by the line of Christian writers beginning with Clement of Rome, who quoted the apocryphal books, apparently without suspecting that they were not a part of the canon. Thus, Clement of Rome places the story of Judith side by side with that of Esther. The wisdom of Sirach is cited by Barnabas and the Didache, and Tobit by Polycarp. Clement of Alexandria and Origen appeal to Tobit and both the wisdoms, to which Origen adds Judith. Our earliest manuscripts of the Greek Bible confirm the impression derived from the quotations of the earliest Christian writers. Their canon corresponds not with that of the great writers of the age when they were written, but with that of the Old Latin version of the Septuagint. Codeces Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus contain the two wisdoms, Tobit and Judith. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are added in Sinaiticus, and 1st through 4th Maccabees in Codex Alexandrinus. Codex C still exhibits the two wisdoms, and when complete may have contained other books in the same class. This is extremely important because he's putting it all together. Why are there differing lists? Why are there some Greek fathers whose lists are very small, talking about 22 books? And then you have other fathers like Augustine and the Council of Carthage, which are much longer. Why is there a mixed tradition? Well, he's connecting the dots that the Rabbinic canon, which came through Jewish teachers, was introduced into the church, and certain fathers followed that teaching, mistaking it for the ancient Christian teaching. So 1st through 3rd century Christian writings, okay, the Apostolic Fathers, the Didache, indicate the Latin canon expressed at the Council of Carthage in 419. And that canon best reflects the earliest Christian view of the canon. And this is evidenced in the Apostolic Fathers and the ancient manuscripts, as Sweet noted. 3rd through 4th century lists by fathers, which are shorter, indicate the influence of Origen and follow the rabbinic teaching, not their own Christian tradition. Okay, so smaller lists like in Gregory Nazianzen, St. Cyril of Jerusalem, Epiphanius, Rufinus, okay? All of these present smaller canons, 22-book canons, and so on. But what Sweet is connecting is that no one is talking about 22 books or using only 22 books as scripture until after the time of Origen. And Origen would have picked that up from the Jews of his time, the rabbinic Jews. So there's an earlier, more ancient Christian canon, which is larger, which is represented by the, quote, Latin canon, but he's talking about the canon of Carthage and Augustine, who was a staunch defender of the Septuagint. So when an ancient list corresponds to the shorter 22-book canon, we can distinguish it from lists which represent the authentic Orthodox canon from apostolic tradition. So having an understanding of why there are two kinds of lists, there's this shorter list and longer list, helps us to distinguish between the ones which are authentic to the apostolic tradition, represented in the earliest fathers like St. Clement of Rome, not the later rabbinic ones. So just understanding the historical context is super important in this discussion. It's not totally random. Fathers are not just making it up as they go. There are historical time periods which come with their own biases, and we can understand the list within their historical context to get an understanding of what the canon was, whether it was authentically Christian or whether it was based in some kind of outside influence. Now, another super important point that we have to talk about when discussing the canon is the Protestant influence in the Russian Empire in the 19th century. I don't hear a lot of people talking about this, but it's very, very important, okay? So if you read the Russian Synodal Bible or the Catechism of St. Philaret of Moscow or Orthodox Dogmatic Theology by Father Michael Pomazansky, you will notice that they have in common that the Protestant canon, the books of the Protestant canon, alone are recognized as canonical. Now, why is that? Why is that the case? Well, many people will look at this and say, see, the Russian Orthodox Church has a different canon. There's disagreement in the Orthodox Church. But again, we have to understand the history of this teaching and put it in its historical context. All of these have in common one thing. They're coming out of a particular school of thought in 19th century Russia. Okay, so let's dig into the history of this. The tradition of separating the canonical books from the non-canonical books is not a part of the Slavonic tradition. So before the 19th century, the Russian Orthodox Church and all Slavic churches drew from the Slavonic tradition, which was based in the ancient Byzantine tradition, and they didn't distinguish between canonical and deuterocanonical books as, non-canonical, like you see in the Russian Synodal Bible. So what changed in the 19th century in Russia? Well, it all started around the time of St. Philaret of Moscow. Okay, now this is not to pick on St. Philaret of Moscow. I love St. Philaret, and we venerate him as Orthodox Christians. But we have to understand him in his historical context. It's very important. Now, his opinion on the Bible canon was influenced by Protestantism through the British and Foreign Bible Society and the Mason-funded Russian Bible Society. Okay, so these were societies that were operating in Russia during the time of Philaret of Moscow, and he was actually a leading member of the Russian Bible Society, and through this society came Protestant ideas about the canon, and that Russian Bible Society really leaned on Western, especially Protestant biblical scholarship. Now, this is not controversial. If you want to dig in deep onto this topic, I highly recommend this book, Russian Bible Wars, because it'll go into the details about the history of the Russian Bible translations and Philaret of Moscow and the Russian Bible Society and the Protestant and Mason influence that went into that project of producing the Russian Synodal Bible. It's very important, I think. And again, just to clarify, I'm not picking on Philaret of Moscow. I'm not picking on the Russian Synodal Bible. I'm just saying to put them in their historical context so that you understand them in the broader picture. So influenced by Protestant biblical scholarship, He endorsed a hybrid approach to the Bible, placing priority on the Masoretic text, and produced a tiered Bible where the books of the Protestant canon alone were recognized as canonical. So the synodal Bible that came out of the work of St. Phileret of Moscow was sort of a hybrid, because on one side there were Russians who were very traditional, who said, no, we want to stick to the Septuagint and the larger canon, where the other side were following Protestant biblical scholarship, saying, no, we want to have a Masoretic text alone with the smaller Protestant canon. And St. Phileret was in the middle trying to bridge these. So he came up with the synodal Bible that was a kind of hybrid, where he kept the deuterocanonical books but separated them according to the canonical books of the Masoretic text. And he based it primarily on the Masoretic text, but had some influence from the Septuagint. Okay, so his views on the Bible canon, which really reflect Protestant views, are reflected in his translation of the Confession of Dositheus, where he removed the decree on the Bible canon, which is very interesting. I think he knew that the Bible canon from the Confession of Dositheus would have been controversial in Russia at the time, so he just removed it. In his catechism, he pushes for that Protestant canon. The Russian Synodal Bible will separate the deuterocanonical books and label them as non-canonical. But the influence of Phileret and the school of thought coming out of 19th century Russia really impacted many writers and thinkers in that time, like Father Michael Pomazansky, who, again, we love Father Michael Pomazansky, but he's not immune to the historical circumstances of his life. And we can see that St. Phileret influence on his own writings. So we just need to be careful when we take these things and we isolate them and we pit them against the entire tradition of the church. We need to put them in their historical context to understand them. So in 3 columns, I have compared the Ostrog Bible and the contents it contains, which is an old Slavonic Bible, the Elizabeth Bible, which contains the exact same books, and then this Synodal Bible produced under St. Phileret of Moscow. And you can see that the deuterocanonical books in the Slavonic tradition are a part of the rest of the Bible and included along with it. But in the Synodal Bible, they were moved into the end and labeled as non-canonical. So again, I'm trying to hammer down the point that the Synodal Bible, the Protestant canon, is not a native part of the Slavonic tradition in Russia. This was something new in the 19th century, which in some places, in some people, and some writers lingered for some time. So we just need to make a careful distinction between the ancient Slavonic tradition, which is much more in accordance with the wider Orthodox Church, from the work of Metropolitan Phileret of Moscow, and keep those two things in contrast and not get confused. So a chart to kind of show the relationship of these things. Both Greek Orthodoxy and Slavic Orthodoxy are drawing from the same Byzantine Orthodoxy with its large canon. And you can see that by comparing the Elizabeth Bible, that Slavonic Bible, with the Greek Orthodox Bible. The contents are virtually identical. But you can see after Protestantism was influencing Russia, a kind of hybrid Bible came out, the Russian Synodal Bible, with a smaller canon and the deuterocanonical books indexed in the back of the Bible. So this is the relationship between these things. It's not as simple as what many people say. They'll say, oh, the Russian Orthodox Church has a different Bible. Not exactly. It's much more complex than that. So we just need to be aware, again, of the historical circumstances of some of these catechisms, some of these Bible editions, that there are real reasons why they have the canon that they have, and it may not be reflecting the actual Orthodox tradition or even its own Slavonic tradition. Now, St. Philaret's Masoretic prioritism and smaller canon were opposed by many Orthodox within the Russian Empire. This is huge. These ideas were not well received by many people in the Russian Orthodox Church. One big example is St. Theophan the Recluse, who rejected the use of the Masoretic text for the Bible and rejected reducing the Bible and removing the deuterocanonical books from the canon. He was a traditionalist, and he stood with the Slavonic tradition of the Russian Orthodox Church and opposed some of these new ideas. So this is not a universal view, right? The Protestant canon in the Russian Synodal Bible does not reflect a universal Russian view. Within Russia, and does not have an official status in the Russian Orthodox Church. This is also very important. No official decision was ever made on the textual base and the canon of the Russian Orthodox Bible, right? So the Synodal Bible was really a practical Bible to give the average Russian people access to the Bible. That was its purpose. Its purpose was not to make an official declaration on which books were canonical. So the Bible disputes ended very abruptly in Russia due to the Soviet Revolution. So these issues and debates and disputes about the textual base and canon of the Bible in Russia never really were resolved. They were ended abruptly because they could not continue under the persecution of the Soviet Union. So they weren't ever resolved. So people say, oh, the Russians use a different canon, really don't know what they're talking about. The situation is far more complicated than that. So Stephen Batalden writes, the debate over the textual base for the modern Russian Old Testament would continue to inflame Russian biblical studies throughout the 19th century and remains largely unresolved to the present. So again, I highly recommend this book if you want to go deeper on this topic. It's very interesting to study the disputes and the Bible wars of 19th century Russia, but it really debunks that simple attack saying, oh, the Orthodox Church doesn't know what the Bible is. Russia has a different canon. It's far more complicated than that. Now, this historical context of the Russian Synodal Bible helps to explain why there are differing opinions, okay? So it's not that the Orthodox are all over the board. The situation is there's a particular historical strain of thought that comes out of a very specific local church from a very specific time under very specific political circumstances. So that doesn't reflect back on the entire Orthodox Church. It doesn't even reflect back on Russia itself, right? Not even all Russians accepted that smaller canon. So the Catechism of Philaret and the Synodal Bible are works within a particular historical context and should not be propped up as the official views of the canon for Orthodoxy or even for Russian Orthodoxy. And I'm not saying they're bad, I'm just saying put them in context. There's a reason why the Protestant canon is in the Russian Synodal Bible. It has to do with when it was made within the Bible wars that were happening during the 19th century in Russia. And we can think of St. Philaret much like how we think of St. Jerome, that he's a pioneer of biblical studies, but due to some outside influence, made some slightly off statements about the canon, and he's not infallible and never claimed to be. So we have no problem acknowledging certain mistakes in these saints. We appreciate St. Philaret for what he produced. He did produce a Bible for the Orthodox people in Russia, and after the Soviet Revolution, people were just happy to have a Bible at all. So what they had from St. Philaret was really a gift and a treasure. But to abuse that Bible and to say that it represents the universal Russian Orthodox view is just a historic mistake. So that's not a very good argument. So we have an excellent quote here on this from Eugene Pentiuk. He says, it should be added here too that the important Russian Catechism of Philaret, Metropolitan of Moscow, rejects the Septuagint editions from the list of canonical books. None of the confessions and statements discussed above, that's including the Catechism from Philaret, should be considered as representing the Eastern Orthodox tradition as a whole. They were crafted under the pressure of several controversies between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, at a time when, due to political and cultural factors, Orthodox theological education was at an all-time low. Thus, they often simply repeat the Roman Catholic responses to Protestants or vice versa. So the materials coming out of 19th century Russia and early 20th century Russia, put them in historical context. They might be drawing from a particular view within Russia, but don't represent the entire Russian view and certainly don't represent the wider Orthodox view. Now, very importantly, the Russian Orthodox Church's official liturgical Bible is still the Elizabeth Bible. So even though the St. Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow produced the Synodal Bible, it didn't replace the use of the Slavonic Bible, the Elizabeth Bible, in the liturgical life of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is very important, very interesting, because now you have the Russian Orthodox Church has two Bibles, one for home reading, which has no official ecclesiastical status, but is in contemporary Russian for people to read. And then you have the Elizabeth Bible, which is the official liturgical Bible of their services. And that's very important because one has ecclesiastical stamp of approval, the Elizabeth Bible, because it's used in their liturgies. Okay, so the important takeaway here, and why I highlight this so strongly, is the Slavonic Bible aligns with the Greek Bible tradition. So there is unity, there's canonical unity in the Slavonic tradition, which is still alive in the liturgical life of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Greek Orthodox Bible and the Greek Orthodox liturgical tradition. They are very much on the same page when it comes to the canon and the liturgical life in the official Bibles that they recognize for church use. Okay, so the Slavonic Elizabeth Bible and the Greek Orthodox Bible, the Apostoliki Diakonia, if you look at the contents, they differ only in their appendix. There's a one book difference, and it's in the appendix. It's not even in the main canonical material. Their main canonical material is identical. So it's very important to acknowledge that the official scriptures acknowledged and used in the liturgical life of each expression of the Orthodox faith is identical. They're not at each other's throats on this at all by any means. So the claim that Russia has a different Bible canon is just false. It's far more complicated than that. They have the Elizabeth Bible, which aligns with the wider Orthodox Church canon, and that is the technical official Bible of the liturgical life of the church. But then they have the Synodal Bible, which reflects a particular 19th century view based on the Protestant canon. Okay, the Russian Orthodox Church still maintains its ancient Slavonic heritage, which is the same heritage as the other Orthodox churches. They're all drawing from the ancient Byzantine heritage. It's very, very important to acknowledge. So in conclusion, Protestants and Catholics can't point fingers at the Orthodox without attacking their own biblical heritage. Okay, it was a mess from the very beginning when it comes to certain particular disputed books, but most of the books are in agreement and we can know for certain. But even the books that are in dispute, we can also know for certain based off of other witnesses in our tradition. The Orthodox Church has an epistemic basis for the canon in its sacred tradition, and we can know that tradition through the expressions of the church, the fathers, the councils, the liturgical life, and so on. Early Christian lists are sometimes mingled with rabbinic teaching. By identifying this historical context, we're able to discern between which lists represent the actual authentic Christian tradition and the rabbinic teaching of the time. It's very important. And then some modern writers and Bible translations are influenced by Protestantism, especially in 19th century Russia, but those don't have any official status in the Orthodox Church. They're more practical in nature to give the average Russian people the ability to read the Bible at home. So the traditional Christian canon is known through the life of the church and is represented in St. Augustine, who was a staunch defender of the Septuagint, which was used widely in the church at that time. The Syro-Hexapla, which represents the Septuagint tradition, the Council of Carthage, the Synod of Jerusalem in 1672, the Slavonic Bibles like the Ostrog Bible, the Elizabeth Bible, Gennady Bible, and the Greek Bible like the Apostoliki Diakonia. So you can see that having disputes on certain books of the Bible has nothing to do with the validity or authenticity of a church, because the early church had disputed books, and for where there are disputes, there are very real historic reasons why there are those disputes, the influence from Rabbinic Judaism, the influence from Protestantism, but the official Bibles and the official liturgical life of the Orthodox Church and the expressions of its tradition are all very much in agreement on the canon. So that's all for today. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. I love hearing from you, and hit that subscribe button because I have more Bible topic videos coming out soon in the near future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.